3.5 inches has become the go-to freestyle FPV quad if you don't want to fly 5 inches and you want to fly something probably sub 250. Today, I'm going to test that theory out because I have a sneaking suspicion that sub 250, 3.5 inch isn't actually the best option to get something that feels like a 5 inch. Let me explain. The only problem with a 5 inch quad is I have to come out to somewhere like here, and that just means that I can't fly as much. And if you've been in my channel before, you've heard me say this story a million times. So that got me into looking at creating something that is sub 250 but felt like a 5 inch. That actually got me to end up building my first quad, which is this, the Quadmula Siren F3. It's a 6S 3 inch sub 250, and that to me felt a lot like a 5 inch. Over the last year, I've been trying plenty of 3.5 inch bind and flies. I've built 3.5 inch quads as well, and they always feel a little bit lightweight. That said, I don't fly my 5 inch quads that often, and I've never flown them back to back with one of my builds. Today we're going to do exactly that. We're going to fly the 5 inch quad back to back with the 3 inch and 3.5 inch and see if my theory's correct. Because I think actually you can make a 3.5 inch quad feel like a 5 inch, but I get the feeling that it'd be much better off at around 300, maybe 350 grams. So this is what I'm going to be flying today. I've got my Quadmula Siren F5 build, I've got my 3.5 inch build, and I've got my 3 inch build as well. The 3.5 inch and the 3 inch are running almost exactly the same motors, same stack, same everything, both sub 250. The only difference is the size of the arms and the propellers. Welcome on board my Siren F5 build. I'll put the parts that I use for this on the screen so that you can see exactly what I'm working with. This is only actually the second time I've flown this quad, the first being in my last video against the Avata 2. So let me take you through what I'm doing with this flight just to try and get as much feeling from this as possible. As a caveat, it rained pretty heavily last night and the ground is still pretty wet, so I'm trying to take it a little bit easy because I haven't conformal coated this and I don't want to lose it in this long grass. In my opinion, there are a few things that make a 5 inch feel like a 5 inch, and these are the things I've been trying to replicate with some of my smaller quad builds. What has been branded as disc loading is probably the most important. Now, whether you like or hate that term, I think it's probably the easiest way to explain the feel of this. That disc loading is basically the way the quad starts to accelerate once you hit the throttle for takeoff or when you punch it into the air. It helps you to feel the weight of the quad and the momentum that you're generating. If the disc loading is too high, it'll make you feel like you're bloated, heavy, and need more power. If it's too low, it'll feel very, very lightweight at lower throttle and make it feel very twitchy when you take off or fly low. So during this video, you'll see me skating back and forth and straight lining low to the ground to test how stable I can keep the quad at the lower end of the throttle. Getting that disc loading in the right spot helps with two other attributes that make a 5 inch feel like a 5 inch, the punch and the catch. Once a 5 inch gets going, it only requires a quick blip of the throttle at the high end to send it hurtling forwards or upwards. The distance a 5 inch will travel at full throttle is pretty far, as you can see from how high up my power loops are going. And then there's the catch. When a 5 inch is coming back down again, you can ease on the throttle and the power comes in smoothly to catch it off the trick without hitting the floor. A smooth catch is by far easier on a 5 inch because that throttle is so predictable. This is my second flight with this, and already I'm getting comfortable with catching it smoothly and closer to the floor. The next two are one and the same, and this is the fling and the hang time that you get. This 5 inch all up weight is around 489 grams, my GEP RC Mark V is around about 500 grams, and at that weight, when you send it and come off the throttle, the quad keeps moving in that trajectory for quite a while. That hang time gives you the time to think about what you're doing upside down and what you want to do next. And it's not just for tricks. The slow, smooth rolls that I'm doing in this video are easy on a 5 inch, but way more difficult to maintain a consistent speed without falling out of the air on smaller quads. This is a matter of physics though. The momentum that you can build with a quad half this weight is never going to feel the same. But how close can we get with a smaller one? Let's find out. So that is a go with Siren F5. I'm now going to switch to the 3-inch. I get the feeling the 3-inch is actually much better for this type of thing because of the smaller props. It means that you have to kind of give it a bit of fling to go. I don't think it has as much hang time, but let's give it a go. I've never flown these back to back, so maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised. I'm also using mini mortal antennas on my sub 250 drones, which means I can't go as far. So we'll see how far this works and if I can get behind those trees as well. Okay, this is the Siren F3. A bit of shape on that. Bring that back in. That doesn't feel right. I don't know if you could see that on the video, but the video feed was vibrating quite a bit, so it felt like something was loose. I checked all of the connections, the motor screws, the prop screws, made sure nothing could be affecting the gyro. And at the time I didn't see anything, but I was actually missing a screw on one side of the camera mount. I had to make some emergency repairs to this the day before, and I totally forgot to put that screw back in. So unfortunately, you're going to enjoy jello from this next 3-inch flight, but if you can get past this, you'll be able to see the similarities and some of the differences between this and the 5-inch. Okay, so please try and ignore the camera shaking like somebody's trying to crimp one off after 5 days of constipation, and let's focus on the feel of the flight. Like I said in the previous flight, straight away this feels very similar to a 5-inch on the takeoff. You can feel the weight of the quad really nicely, and you don't feel like you've just sent it to moon just by slowly raising the throttle. So just as a reminder, this is the first time I've actually flown this back to back with a 5-inch, even though I've flown this a million times. So this is why I'm quite impressed with how this feels at the moment. You can see here, as I'm trying to do some slow rolls and slower movements, this is not quite as smooth as it is with the 5-inch. You just don't get the same amount of momentum to punch forward, so you have to roll a little bit faster. The main thing is that even though my throttle curve is linear in beta flight, there's a lot of low down resolution, and I can control it from slower maneuvers pretty well. I tend to fly this quite close to the ground and normally have no issues holding this a few inches off the floor, and I don't have to worry about bouncing all over the place. As I do power loops, you can feel the quad respond very, very much like a 5-inch. It does feel a little bit lighter, but that doesn't feel like I'm flying something that is sub 250. And I'm actually really impressed with this. This is the first quad I ever built, and I've flown this more than anything I own, and now I feel like I've been spoiled. But it doesn't cover as much ground as a 5-inch, and it doesn't have the same throw. But it feels like having a scaled down version, so if you fly smaller areas, which I tend to do normally, this is like really good for that. It kind of works for me. It looks like I'm running out of memory on my SD card, so I'm going to bring this back in and then take the 3.5-inch up. Again. That feels really good. So that is the 3-inch, and actually that feels a lot like a 5-inch. It's the same kind of disc loading, so as you hit the throttle, it takes a little bit of time for that to spin up. And my theory is on the 3.5-inch, you don't get as much of that, and I think that's more because of the weight than it is because it's 3.5 inches. As I said, this is almost exactly the same weight as this. Okay, so really quickly, I use these GNB 380 batteries on my sub 250 builds. They're all 6S, but this was like 20 grams lighter. So what I thought I would do is actually get one of these, which is a 530 battery, which will give me a little bit more power, but also it brings this up to 249 grams roughly, because there's a lot of extra weight in there. And hopefully with that weight, I'll get to test this as a normal sub 250 and see if that makes a difference in what I was feeling the first time I flew this, which was that it was quite lightweight and floaty. Okay, this is the 3.5-inch. So taking the 3.5-inch up. So right there, that's what I'm talking about. That takeoff happened with such a small amount of throttle, and that made it feel ultra light straight away. Okay, so I'm going to try a power loop, and you can see there, in comparison to the 3-inch, I gained a lot more altitude. It's kind of a bit more like how the 5-inch performs in that respect. So I'm just going to try a slow eject here, and it it travels way more than the 3-inch. Remember, this is basically the same build, just with larger props. So I'm quite surprised at how much of a difference there is. I feel like this is also giving me a bit more hang time. I think it gives me more than the 3-inch. I wouldn't say it's quite up there with the 5-inch, as when you punch it, the momentum kind of drops off quicker than the 5-inch, but flinging it upside down does feel pretty good. I just need to be careful going too far. I'm still using the tiny antenna on this, so I don't know how far I can go with this without losing connection. But you can flick it quite nicely, although managing lower throttle maneuvers is actually more difficult because it just doesn't have the same resolution. Just kind of hovering or trying to fly close to the ground, I'm already feeling a much bigger difference in comparison to the 3-inch. I think when I'm kind of slow rolling this, it definitely doesn't feel like a 5-inch there. It's still, you feel like you have to complete that maneuver much faster. Oh, so that's interesting. It definitely doesn't feel like a 5-inch when you catch it off of a trick. Throttling back up doesn't feel as smooth to bring the power back in, and it doesn't feel as predictable as it does on the 3 and the 5-inch. And yeah, so if I caught that the same that I did with the other two, you can see me bounce off of that. I guess that's something you could get used to and compensate for, but I think the resolution at the lower end of the throttle on this is a lot less than the other two. And if you want to switch between this and a 5-inch and try and, use them for training, this is actually much less like the 5-inch in comparison to the 3-inch that way. But I still think that, potentially flying this at 300 or 350 might be actually much better. But let me bring this back in and then I can give you some of my thoughts on what's going on. Okay, so let me give you a quick rundown, and there's going to be much more testing on that 3.5-inch. It does feel really good when you're upside down. It feels like you fling it, and there's a lot of hang time, especially when you're upside down in comparison to this. Now on the 3-inch, that disc loading, as you use the throttle, it feels much more like a 5-inch. I think if you're doing close proximity work in a smaller area, this, like, hands down feels way more like a 5-inch. If you're going to come out into the middle of like somewhere like here, then probably this, but then why wouldn't you just fly a 5-inch? Yeah, this is a tough decision. I think I'm going to do a bit more testing with this. I still think that at about 300 grams, this thing will fly way more like a 5-inch. I think if you're using maybe an action cam on this, it will also, that added weight will fly like a 5-inch, but I think sub 250, the 3-inch is pretty good, especially for small areas. For me, flying in like tiny parks and that kind of thing, the 3-inch is probably still going to be my go-to. Since filming this, I've also done some more test flights in smaller areas to make sure I didn't just get these results because I'm in a wide open field, and I'm pretty confident in my initial conclusion. Firstly, let's address the biggest point here. That extra 1/2 inch on the prop makes a massive difference, much bigger than what I originally thought. The disc loading and throttle resolution at the lower end is just too low on the 3.5-inch prop. In order to compensate for that additional thrust, I'm trying out a few things. In this video, you can see that I'm running a 4S battery on a 6S build, and it does make a nice difference at the low end, but it's not quite enough. I have a larger battery on its way that will bring this up to 300 grams, and then I can see if that makes it feel more 5-inchy. Other ideas I've had are to limit the motor output, change the throttle curve, or reduce the motor size to 1404. But I'd like to hear from you. Have you built a 3.5-inch sub 250 gram quad that feels like a 5-inch? What would you recommend? For now, I'm sticking with the 3-inch. It feels way closer to the 5-inch, the only caveat being that everything is scaled down to make it feel that way. So you'll have to stay on the throttle a little bit longer if you're used to flying a spot with a 5-inch. But yeah, sub 250, I would go 3-inch all day. That said, I've just built something for my next video that might completely change my mind on everything I've just said. Or maybe I've just hyped this up in my head over the last couple of years so much, and I'm going to be hugely disappointed. But when that video is ready, I'm going to put it up here.